Hello and welcome to Post Point, a podcast where we here at the Puyallup Post cover the insights of running a newspaper and talk about the topics in our community. My name is Steven Gonzalez.
I'm Victor Felion.
And today we have a special guest with us. Please introduce Captain Portmann of the Puyallup Police Department.
Good morning, guys.
Thank you for being with us today, Captain Portmann. Hope you're doing well. Hope the weather didn't push you off too much.
Oh no, it's a beautiful day.
So, for starters, for anybody who doesn't know, this was the first quarter we were reaching out to the Puyallup Police Department, and we wanted to see about getting a partnership with them, seeing if we can help bring awareness to some of the things they're doing in our community, see if we can get some of the people that are going to class in the criminal justice program here at Pierce College, see if we can get them to be a little bit more interested in what we've got going on versus the interest they have already, trying to sort of tie them all back together. And this was our first attempt at that, and just kind of going into it from where you're standing, Captain Portmann, how do you think things all sort of panned out?
I think things went well, actually. This was a great opportunity for the police department and the college to work together on a collaborative project, I guess, so to speak, and give the reporters some experience and also allow us to have some outreach on campus.
Honestly, I was a little taken aback because I didn't get to be as hands-on as I wanted to, and that's one of the things with being in charge. You come to realize that your scope is so wide set that you don't have time to focus on all the ins and outs you wanted to. And when we first started out the quarter, I felt very involved, and as time went on, I had to divert my attention to other things, and I just thought to myself, I was like, man, I hope things are going well. I haven't heard anything negative, so I have to assume that things are going well between us.
They are, and that's actually called delegation, right? Yeah. You delegated, and it was actually nice to have the opportunity to work with a few different reporters here on campus.
That's good. I'm glad to hear that. We have to be doing something, right? Because reporter Don Hammer mentioned that things have been slowly escalating well with Captain Shaw as well over at the fire department.
Yeah, Captain Shaw, my counterpart on the fire side, he and I work closely together on a lot of projects, and I know that Central Pierce shares the same kind of enthusiasm as I do when it comes to community outreach.
All right, so for starters, just to kind of get a good view of kind of the direction we're going to take this, we'll see where we go with it. I was curious to hear your thoughts on capital punishment in our country. We covered something recently in my ethics class, and we got into a pretty good debate about it. And I wanted to do something similar with the paper, but it had actually already been done recent enough that I was like, But, being with your position and the fact that we haven't spoken to you on this matter before, I think you can provide a fresh take that would be pretty interesting to hear about.
Sure. First, let me preface this by saying this is my opinion. This is not necessarily the opinion of the Puyallup Police Department as it relates to capital punishment. And I'll just put it out there. Do I think that it has a role in the criminal justice system? Yes, I do, actually. I believe that it's a tool that we use, obviously, for the worst of the worst offenders. Do I think that it necessarily prevents people from committing horrible crimes? No. But I do think that when you look at prosecuting these types of people, especially the ones that are, serial killers and things, it's something that we can hold, over them to help them cooperate with us to some degree, to bring closure to victims' families, in terms of maybe, as you see it most recently in the newspaper, right, has been the Green River Killer or, some of these other heinous serial killers. They were able to find the victims and bring them home to their families, and that's important. And if that's whether or not that's the right way for the law to be applied, I think the Supreme Court's probably told us it's not necessarily here in the state of Washington, anyways. But I do think that it did have a place in the justice system. Obviously, it's been overturned here in the state, but.
When I think of things like the death penalty, I liken it to the sausage metaphor, where they're like, everybody enjoys sausage, but nobody wants to see how the sausage is made type scenario. Where I think that sometimes people are willing to turn a blind eye to the means if it gets to a specific end that we're all looking towards. But the minute the veil gets lifted and we all get brought to that point, people all of a sudden have an opinion on the matter, and people don't want this or that. And I think a lot of the issues with the capital punishment can be the sort of the delicate sensibilities of civilians just kind of looking on. And even if it wasn't the greatest deterrent when it comes to how actual criminals view it, you can't help but think that after a certain point, its benefit holds in the fact that, like you said, it provides that closure for family members that really, as far as I can tell, don't have much beyond that in that setting other than getting to put the whole situation behind them, you know? If they've already lost a loved one in an instance, how much else can they get out of that knowing that, oh, so-and-so's going to be put away for a long time, you know?
So first, let me just say this. They never put this behind them, right? They've lost a family member, a friend. This never goes away. It does, when I say closure, it does bring a sense, this is, again, my experience in dealing with this after over 21 years, it does bring, I guess, it helps them move forward, but it doesn't ever really go away for them. And, you know, they may not know how the person, or they may not even want to know how the person was killed or anything like that, but it does, they know that they've been brought home, so to speak, right? And so that's when I talk about the trade-offs with it. I also want to say that, you know, it's important like any, and as the court had found recently, it's important with any law that it's applied fairly and equitably, and that was the challenge that we had, I believe, this last Supreme Court case as it relates to this. And so when I say it's a tool, again, I mean it's a tool that has to be used appropriately, and that means fairly and equitably.
So it was in a sociology class that I learned about recidivism, and I remember on first insight of hearing it, I thought it was a very interesting idea, and it's one of those things that seems common enough that when you're like, yeah, no, that makes sense. Of course they would be measuring something like that. But I find when I first found out about it, I thought it was really interesting, and I started measuring it depending on like other states I've been to. And I was I was curious to know like who has, you know, the highest levels and who has the lowest levels and whatnot. And I found out in the state of Washington that there's a current plan in order to get it lowered to 25% by 2020. Right now, at least on the website I was looking at, it was at 27.8%. And I couldn't find a date to attach to it to actually gauge the recency. But I figure if they're gauging for 25% by 2020, the furthest I could consider it being back is 2016, because in sociology, when we covered it in the state of Washington, it was around the same percentage, and that was a 2016 textbook we were running off of. So in your opinion, a drop by, say, 1.5% by 2020, how realistic is that when we're actually looking at recidivism?
I think it's possible. I'm not sure how realistic it is, of course. I'm not the expert when it comes to, you know, incarceration. Mm-hmm. My job is to, you know, make sure people are safe and to, you know, catch criminals and things like that. But when it comes to reforming the criminal, which is really what the correction system is should be or is intended to do, they're the experts in that. I will say this, that if you want to, I believe if you want to reduce recidivism, there's a lot of programs out there that have been proven to work around the nation, and so we probably should be looking at those best practices and adopting those here in the state of Washington. And maybe the study that you speak of has done that. I know that just in, you know, I've arrested the same criminal over and over and over again, and I know that, you know, what's the definition of insanity is, you know.
Yeah.
You guys know the saying. So, you know, I think that we have to, as much as maybe the public doesn't want us to believe this, we need to put probably more money into the correction system to give them the tools and the skills and the abilities to help these folks. And so if that's drug treatment, or that's mental health, or that's, you know, different types of job or apprenticeship programs, simply, you know, putting somebody away for 5 years or 6 years or 4 years or 10 years or whatever that is, and then releasing them back into their same environment without any skills or any coping mechanisms, it's pretty obvious why we have a recidivism rate of 26 or 27%.
Right. What are your thoughts on sort of where that money should be coming from? Because I think one of the things that brings a lot of chagrin from the general populace is the idea that usually when money goes into prisons, that means it's coming from somewhere else that it could have been going into. When I think about that, the first thing that comes to mind is the state of California, because I know from some research I did in sociology that last year they put, it was roughly $7 to $9 million into higher education in their state, and it was around 14 to 15 million into the prison system. And I know when people, even though you just made good credence to the fact that that's a necessity, sometimes people hear those number comparisons and it gets them a little on edge to consider that from the outside perspective, it appears as if we're putting more money into keeping people locked up than it is consulting with our future education for our future generations.
So I would say if we could reduce the recidivism rate, we're going to reduce the amount of money we spend on the corrections industry, if we want to call it that. So by spending money up front, i.e. giving them, a job training or drug abuse or drug treatment or something along those lines, I would surmise that potentially if they get out and they don't commit another crime, that we probably are money ahead, because it's thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars a year to house someone in the prison system. Whereas, if we can reduce that total number, that should in turn free up money downstream. So the money that you're going to put in, say maybe that there is higher ed money and things that go into the prison system, if we can drive down the amount of people who are committing crimes, I would again think that it would help drive down the total amount of money that's necessary to run the prison system and thereby free up money downstream. It's not going to happen overnight, but theoretically, right, it should happen once we start seeing the recidivism rate drop.
Right. It's a little off topic, but you made me think of it when you called it the corrections industry. When I think of industry and I think of prison, I think of the private prisons that get run in our country and that get a pretty negative rap. And in your personal opinion, what do you think about private prisons?
I haven't studied the topic much because here in Washington, we have, of course, Puyallup has their own local jail,
Right.
And it's a municipal jail. And when we contract with other municipal facilities. I do believe at some point, and maybe it still is a practice here in the state of Washington, to use private prisons, so to speak. I'm not opposed to them if they are, well regulated, and if there are systems in place to ensure that the people in those institutions are being treated humanely and properly and in accordance with our Constitution.
There's been a lot of talk lately about sort of the treatment of prisoners, and I guess lately isn't there's been a lot of talk about that since I've been alive, as far as I can tell, but I've seen a lot of studies recently about how certain prisons are allowing prisoners to keep cats as pets, or some of them have TVs in their cells, and it's supposed to incentivize good behavior. What are your thoughts on that?
I think any program that has shown to be successful, or should be utilized. So specifically, maybe we didn't read the same article as you, but I do know that the giving a dog or a pet, a cat, a dog, or whatever to a prisoner, or to a person, let's just call them a person right there, has shown to help that person develop empathy or sympathy or something like that, things that they maybe didn't have because of their upbringing. Maybe it teaches them to love, right? And so if that works, that works. I say we do it. And I think it makes sense. It goes back to, again, trying to reduce the recidivism rate. And if we can go to a shelter and gather all the dogs and cats and bring them to a prison, and it helps, some of those folks develop those basic kind of life, things, i.e. learning to love and having empathy or sympathy, then I'm all for it.
So when I walked into the office, you were reading our latest issue of the Puyallup Post, which is, mind you, always what I want to see. But what are your thoughts on some of the bigger stories we did about the Puyallup Police Department this quarter?
I was pretty excited about the most recent one that I saw, which was the one that talked about Pierce College grads, and I really like the spin that was put on it in terms of talking about our officers in the community and the college and how they all interconnect, and that kind of made me smile, because that's really what we're about here. I'm a citizen, you're a citizen, and that's the whole thing with law enforcement, right? It's citizens policing other citizens, and working in a community to have to provide a safe environment for everyone. And so I read that, and what the article, did really hit it out of the park on is the fact that our guys do care about and gals do care about the community that they police, and they want to make sure that everyone's safe, and they want to make sure that we do it in a fair manner, and that we treat everyone with respect and dignity and all those things. So I think that was the article that I most enjoyed. We also put that out on our social media pages, Facebook and Twitter. So
I think when we consider a lot of jobs, not even just police officers, but anything really, like food service or anything I can think of, typically the people on the receiving end that aren't involved in the job, they tend to lose sight of incentive when it comes to positions. And when you think about, for instance, customer service, any job in customer service, I always try not to give the person a hard time if there's some mishaps that happen throughout the transaction, because at the end of the day, I know more than likely this job isn't too enjoyable for them either, and they're doing that as a means to an end for what they're actually trying to do, whether that entails going back to college, going to a trade school. Like, it's the bigger picture in order. And I think when people think of police officers, they tend to lose track of their incentive and their intentions, because you get pulled over and you're getting a ticket, and it's very easy to get lost in that and get angry and be like, oh, this is like ridiculous. There's other things they could be doing. And with all the talk on police brutality, it's easy to get lost on that. And people end up being afraid of civil servants that really, by the numbers, by their job, are there to protect and serve. And so I think when it comes to that if people really consider that anybody who puts on that uniform did so at a certain point with the intent to help others, I think that would go a long way. But what are your thoughts on sort of the image of the police as of late?
I've been a police officer for 21 years, and I'm sad to see the state that we're in right now, where public trust has been kind of slowly eroding over time, and we found ourselves in a position where people, quite frankly, don't trust the police, and certainly that's maybe not as evident here in Puyallup, but across the nation we see that every day. I got into this job because I wanted to help people, and I know that sounds trite, but to some degree, but I wanted to help people, and I wanted to have a job where every day was different, and I've been able to do that, have that kind of live that experience. Every day is different, and I have been able to help people. When it comes to the way that we treat, this is kind of a general statement, but something I was told when I was a very young officer, and something that I would certainly and did pass on to the people that have worked under me, is treat people like you would want to be treated, and remember that we're seeing these people oftentimes in the most one of the most difficult times in their life, and that goes both ways, right? If you're a victim of a burglary, it's one of the most traumatic days of your life. If you commit a crime, it is a traumatic day in your life, right? Because what led you to have to commit that crime? And I'm so compassion and empathy, I think, are kind of how we work our way out of this predicament that we're in here in law enforcement. I just want to add a couple of other things. We all watch the news and we see what's going on CNN or some of these other networks, and it paints this picture that there's all these rogue officers out there that are doing these horrendous things, and they show a 10-second video of a confrontation. They don't show the whole video. I can't speak for everything across the country, but I can tell you that here in Puyallup, for example, we're going to respond to 70,000 calls a year for service. We're going to use force on people maybe 35 to 40 times a year. Most of that force is going to be a lower level force, right, where we're using like an arm bar to bring the person to the ground because they're resisting. Rarely do we use deadly force here in Puyallup. And out of those 70,000 contacts and those use of force incidents and everything else, we're going to get 50 or so, 50 to 70 complaints or commendations. We call them this. It's the same form. You can actually file a complaint or file a commendation on the same form. But Dawn, your reporter, highlighted this in her last article. And out of those 50 to 70 complaints / commendations, there's going to be a handful of complaints. And the handful of complaints, and I'm talking maybe 6 to 10 a year, there's going to be an issue with the way that the officer treated someone, or did the officer act within policy. Most of the time, those are going to be minor policy violations, maybe rudeness, maybe the officer had a bad day, right? So where I'm going with this is, I think there's this image out there that there's all these cops that are kind of just, thugs that are going out there to do this, and that's not been my experience. My experience has been that the people in my profession are good people. They're moms and dads, brothers and sisters, and that they care a lot about serving their community. And I know of no one who goes out and wants to, cause anyone any extra harm. And so I think we get back to where we were years ago by building trust. And part of what I'm doing here today, working with the college, right, is to be transparent and to come forward and to try to build relationships with people and realize that we're humans too. We make mistakes, certainly, but that we're not what is being portrayed. Was that a little too much?
No, if anything, that's exactly what I was looking for. Out of what you said, I think what sticks out to me is transparency. I think that's the key to a lot of these positions and their images. It's funny because I hadn't thought of it until you mentioned it as well, but the news and the police force are two, industries right now that both do have a problem with public image. People do have a problem trusting the police right now, and people certainly don't trust what they read in newspapers or what they see on television. And for the most part, I think, at least in the instance from where I'm standing from the news, I think that's good and important. I think it's important to be skeptical of what you're reading, of what you're seeing, because it's so easy nowadays to claim to be a subject matter expert of anything. Like, people can claim what they want, and they can have a blog about it, and somebody will read that, and now we have an informed citizen, and for those that can't see, those were air quotes, an informed citizen going off half-cocked and shouting their opinion on the matter. And I think the answer between both the police force and the news is what you just mentioned, is that level of transparency, because if people can see how you get from point A to point B to point C, you really can't have a false claim on the matter, But yeah, I just thought that was interesting to note. So we've kind of roller coastered a bit with serious to lighter topics. I kind of want to kind of slow things down a bit and talk about you as a whole, Captain Portmann. And this might be a bit of a reshuffling of kind of what we talked about a bit way back at the state fair, but for those that didn't end up watching that, I think it'd be interesting to kind of know what led you to the police force, which you touched on a bit already, but maybe just a more specific, elaborate look at what brought you to put on the uniform and, kind of just starting off with that.
Okay. I think I've always been called to public service. When I was 17 years old, I signed up to be a volunteer firefighter, and I lived in a fire station while I went to Pierce for 2 years here on the Puyallup campus, and I responded to calls, and then I went off to college and kind of left the fire service there, and I tested for both police and fire. But on the law enforcement side, I think what drew me to law enforcement was that there's a real variety of things that you can do in law enforcement. If you think about the fire service, and this is no disrespect to my brothers and sisters and that ride around on the red fire engines, but you're a firefighter, or you're a firefighter, paramedic, or something like that, and maybe you can be an arson investigator. But the career path is fairly limited on the fire service. And law enforcement, I've had an opportunity to do incredible things over my 20 plus years, and that, being a detective, working on our problem-oriented policing team, which is really a team that was developed to go out and work in the neighborhoods and the community, promoting up serving on a variety of other of different specialties, a civil disturbance team, or things like that. That's what kind of drew me to law enforcement. As I said at the beginning, every day is different. Well, in my career, I've had to when I get kind of bored with something, I can move and do something different. So there's a wide variety of things that you can do in law enforcement that you can't do in other professions. That are more maybe they're more scoped. So that's one thing. And just I will go back to the idea of serving. I like people. I like to be with people, and so the whole serving the community and meeting people, different people every day is something that I found just wonderful about law enforcement. So.
Did you, when you first, found yourself in this career, did you go into it thinking you'd be a part of it as long as you have been?
That's a good question. I didn't know where it would take me. I'm glad that it's taken me to where I am today. I love working in Puyallup, and I love working for Puyallup PD. This is my third agency, actually. I started up in Snohomish, and I lateraled to Renton, and then I lateraled to Puyallup, which is home. I grew up in this area, but when I started in Snohomish, I was actually a student I just finished up at Western Washington University, so that was kind of the tie there to them to test while I was close to campus, so to speak. So I didn't really know where I would go and how long I would stay here. I'm glad that I've done the time that I've done. I'm proud of my service to the community, and I look forward to at least a few more years of doing this. So, yeah.
Do you ever kind of have a desire to maybe move somewhere else and try policing in that area, or is Puyallup kind of your set spot now at this point?
Puyallup is my set spot. I said I've worked Snohomish, which was a smaller city, right? About 8,000 people. I went to work in Renton, which is 100,000 people, and then I of course came to Puyallup, and I think Puyallup is a nice blend. It has enough to keep you busy, but not enough to overwhelm you. And I also like this, what I like about Puyallup, and this is probably maybe the same that could be said for any agency our size and the community that we police here in Puyallup, is that I really do feel like the people in Puyallup generally support the police. When I drive around, they wave at me with all of their fingers, not just a few. Or so I feel like that this is home. This is where I want to finish. I've worked a long time with a lot of these folks, and they're like family, and so yeah, I don't see myself moving. And then I just kind of to hit back a little bit on what you were, one of your prior questions. Why I got into this job. I will say that I got into this job like a lot of people too, to chase the bad guy, right? But as I've grown older and done more of this work, I realized that chasing the bad guy is a very small component. And again, to harken back on building those relationships, it's working with the community that's really the most important part of our job. And that means going to a vehicle prowl and understanding the person's had their car prowled and treating that person with respect and building those relationships like we talked about.
The 3 sites you worked at kind of are Goldilocks reminiscent, in that you had one that was kind of small, and then you made that huge jump, and like you said, Puyallup's you're just right. Was the initial jump from Snohomish to Renton a little shell-shocking for you?
It was. When I was in Renton during my training phase, we have a manual of calls that range from a homicide all the way down to your basic theft of a purse from Walmart. And I had my very first day, I was in plain clothes riding with an officer, and I got in a foot pursuit. I got in a pretty big fight during my time. I had a homicide during my time, and where I'm going with this is my manual was basically checked off in like the 12 weeks I was in part of their training program. In Snohomish, I had very little call variety. There's a few DUIs and a few theft reports and a couple of domestic violence calls. But in Renton, the variety of calls were kind of off the charts for me initially. So, and then of course I came to Puyallup, and again, like I said, Puyallup's that blend between the two. We may go a couple of years without having a homicide here in Puyallup, or we may have 2 or 3 in 1 year. But So yeah, I was a little shell shocked at first. Kind of, what did I get myself into? But I really enjoyed my time at Renton, and I believe it gave me a good experience, and helped build me to who I am today.
So you had mentioned before that you'd done some volunteer firefighting. Do you ever find yourself kind of missing that side of things?
It's actually funny you should mention that. I'm actually a fire commissioner. And I was appointed a couple years ago, again, in my community. I live out in Graham, and it's just another opportunity to be able to serve. And so I don't have the time. I wouldn't have the time to necessarily be a volunteer firefighter again, so this was a way for me to give back to the department and to my community there.
So taking Puyallup out of the equation, just looking at Snow Mission Renton, which one did you sort of prefer from the two, and why would you say that you did?
I would say I preferred Renton, and again, I'll put this through a lot of it is where you're at in your life, and so I was a young officer who wanted to have the exposure, who wanted to just have those different calls to help make me a better officer, and so Snohomish didn't really offer that, and had a very limited career path. I mean, they had detectives, and you could do a couple of different things, but Renton had was a much larger department, so it had a lot more opportunities, and so I guess Renton was the right place at the right time for me. I will say that when I came to Puyallup, I thought it was perfect. It was a perfect balance between, again, all those things I talked about, opportunities and call and the call variety and things like that. So, and I still believe that today. I still think Puyallup's a nice balance.
So, like, when you were deciding to be a cop, like, was there any type of hesitant, like were you ever hesitant about any type of things that you would have to go through?
Not really. I had done a lot of ride-alongs. I had several friends who were officers, so I knew what I was getting into. If there was any hesitation, I would say it was with my parents and my fiance. I think they are the ones that had probably the most reservations about me exploring a career in law enforcement. And I'm kind of proud to say I've been married for 21 years, and my wife's been with me the whole time. She's been on this journey as well, and when the day goes for me to hang it up and I'm not an officer anymore, I'm sure she's going to be, I know she's going to be relieved because, our spouses, they live this career with us just like we live the career, and it's hard on them. So I'm really grateful that I have the wife that I have, and how supportive she is. So I guess that'd be my I didn't have any reservations, just I think, the people around me did.
And a less serious question, like, what's your kind of opinion on, like, the representation of cops through, like, film or television? Because, like, I feel like so I work at a movie theater, and, I have friends who are in the military, and a lot of them say they don't like watching films that involve the military or just solely military-based due to the fact that they just don't really want to, there's a lot of misrepresentation or just, like, inaccurate things that they represent in those films.
So I'm sort of like your military buddies, I guess. I feel that same way. My career has not been as exciting as a 2-hour film, I can tell you that. And, a lot of our time is spent, writing reports or doing some of the more mundane things. And it's not as action-packed. And I'm glad it's not as action-packed, to be candid, because that would mean that, we live in a pretty bad world, and I don't really view that. I think we live in a pretty good world, and I certainly police in a really good community. So, yeah, Hollywood wouldn't make stories out of police officers if they probably showed what really went on day in and day out, and that's riding around in a patrol car, stopped at a light, waved to a kid, turn the corner, go take a vehicle prowl or vehicle theft report. Those are the calls that the movies are made of are, for many officers, are once in a lifetime, once in a career type of a call, if that. So, yeah.
Is there anything you'd like to say to all the listeners before we wrap this up, Captain Portman?
I just want to thank you guys for inviting us in to share our perspective, not just on this podcast, but on the stories that you've run through this fall. I think this has been a great relationship. It's one that I hope that we can continue to foster moving forward. I think that, while you've probably learned a little from me or us, I've certainly learned a little from you guys as well. So I just want to thank you for the opportunity to allow us to come and to kind of just say say what we're thinking and give our 2 cents. And so I appreciate that.
Well, thank you. That's a wonderful sentiment. It made me think I want to since we're sort of reaching the capstone of this quarter, I just want to highlight that my initial attempt in this that you and I discussed way back when was that I wanted to highlight everything that was going on in the police force in our area, not in a way as to paint you in a positive light and not in a way as to drag your name through the mud, but into legitimately cast a light over everything that was going on. I wanted to aid in that level of transparency so that the people of Puyallup can look at this as another outlet to see what the police department's doing, to see that they're not doing, this thing that's pushed in this direction so that it can be fed through and be this digestible semblance of heroism. And they're not doing this thing that we can look at and we can jeer over and we can claim this, that, and the other, but they're doing this very realistic thing. And part of that entails keeping everyone safe. And that it's more than just getting pulled over for a speeding ticket or something to that end, that it's a very tangible thing that we should keep in mind before we go drawing accusations of police brutality or something to that end. And hopefully we've accomplished that to some degree. And like you said, ideally this isn't the end of any sort of partnership between us. This is just the beginning of it. And that's certainly the way I want to look at it. But anyway, thanks for listening, you guys. This has been The Post Point. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Share your thoughts with the police department. I'm sure Captain Portmann wouldn't mind seeing that. Follow us through all our social media channels in the description. And thanks, everybody.